Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Quincy Adams, and the focus is Secretary of State, Part 2. The year is 1819. It's the latter stages of James Monroe's first term as President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State. But that era of good feelings that they enjoyed in the first couple of years of this administration were basically coming to an end. And it wasn't partisan divide where one party against another that was causing the challenge. It was more of a geographical divide, North versus South, slaveholding states versus non-slaveholding states. Ever since the compromises in the Constitutional Convention back in 1787, the two sections of the country had pretty much let each other alone on the topic of slavery. The South was happy to have its peculiar institution, as it called it, and the North had agreed that the compromises were made, this was constitutional, it was legal, let the South do what it wants, and the country had persisted along these lines without a lot of strife on the topic. But things were now changing, and it had to do with the acquisition of all that land that came from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, literally doubling the size of the country, 800,000 new square miles, a lot of it agricultural country, and a lot of it areas where the South wanted to expand that institution of slavery. Folks in the North seemed to be relatively okay with keeping slavery in the country, but keeping it confined to the original states that had it. A lot more people in the North were against expansion of slavery into these new territories. And there was a catalyst in 1819 when the state of Missouri started hinting that it wanted to come into the Union and to come in as a slave state. This is the debate that was heating up in the halls of Congress in 1819 and on into 1820. And there was a catalyst in this series of events that really brought out the debate. There was a congressman by the name of John Tallmadge from New York who put it out there as an amendment to potential legislation to bring Missouri in to say anything in the Louisiana territories is off limits to slavery. Well, again, a virulent reaction from those in the South. The Talmadge Amendment did not really go anywhere, but the topic was freshly on the table. Started to talk compromise, which had worked at the Constitutional Convention. Maybe something could happen here. And there was an indication that, well, maybe we'll have Missouri come in as a slave state, and Maine was looking to be ready to come into the Union as well, and that would come in naturally as a free state. So you would keep that balance of 12 slave and 12 free. But there was a movement in Congress to actually go even further. And the likes of folks like Henry Clay, a great compromiser, were trying to think, how can we prevent this from happening over and over again and get something a little bit more permanent in place. So another amendment was proposed, and this owned by Jesse Thomas, a senator from Illinois. He said, going forward, after Missouri, we're going to make anything north of the 3630 parallel, which was the southern tip, the southern border of Missouri. Anything north of that in the Louisiana Territory off limits to slavery, other than Missouri. Anything below that line was fair game for slavery. This is what Thomas had put on the table, and it was an intriguing idea that was debated in Congress and eventually passed. The Missouri Compromise was in place, and the question was for the Monroe cabinet and the Monroe administration, would James Monroe, the president, sign it into law? Would he accept Maine, Missouri coming into the Union as free and slave respectively, and this new line of demarcation going forward to handle slavery expansion in the territories? Well, they did debate it. They talked about the constitutionality of whether or not they believe Congress could put these both opportunities and restrictions on the territories and future states. They agreed that it was, and James Monroe signed the compromise, Missouri Compromise, into law. John Quincy Adams had a really interesting take on this, and we'll use his words to let you hear from his diary what he really thought about what was happening at the time, 1820. He said, I have favored this Missouri Compromise, believing it to be all that could be effected under the present Constitution, and from extreme unwillingness to put the Union at hazard. But then he continued with a really interesting take that not a lot of folks would ever express. He said, but perhaps it would have been a wiser and bolder course to have persisted in the restriction on Missouri until it should have terminated in a convention of the states to revise and amend the Constitution. This would have produced a new union of 13 or 14 states unpolluted with slavery, with a great and glorious object, that of rallying to their standard the other states by the universal emancipation of their slaves. If the Union must be dissolved, slavery is precisely the question upon which it ought to break. John Quincy Adams was coming to the conclusion that maybe it was better off having two countries, not one. One slave, one non-slave, and the duty of the non-slave country would have been to continue to try to impose its will the best it could until slavery was eventually eradicated in the other country. Well, this did not occur. It was possible in 1820, before the Missouri Compromise, there was talk of secession and starting and forming a second country at the time. But this compromise put that back into Pandora's box, where it would stay until it percolated again in the 1840s, 50s, and of course the Civil War in the 1860s. But a really interesting take from John Quincy Adams. Now, Adams was not an abolitionist. He believed the Constitution did protect slavery where it stood, but he didn't like that provision. In fact, he said the bargain between freedom and slavery contained in the Constitution of the United States is morally and politically vicious, inconsistent with the principles on which alone our revolution can be justified, cruel and oppressive, by riveting the chains of slavery, by pledging the faith of freedom to maintain and perpetuate the tyranny of the master. He was against the institution, but he was not a full-on abolitionist, certainly not at this stage of his career. He was worried about his country. He did not like the institution of slavery, but in his mind, sort of having it stand the way it was in the end was probably the most effective result that could be established for the country at this time. His thoughts on the topic would continue to evolve over the next few decades. Well, his job, Secretary of State, obviously foreign affairs was the principal focus of John Quincy Adams in the Monroe cabinet. He had already had a major accomplishment with the Adams-Onís Treaty signed with Spain that brought the Floridas into the American Union. But now there was other stuff going on throughout the Americas that really had his attention. There were those new republics that had claimed their independence from Spain and South America, and Adams was among those prodding President Monroe to recognize these states. And beginning in 1822, the United States did that. Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico. These were now independent republics that the United States was recognizing, coming out from their previous sort of bonds of colonialization based on this vacuum now created by Spain's movement out from the domination over these former colonial holdings. But there was still concern about whether or not this was going to be a stable environment. Europe still had colonization on its mind. There were other countries that could have come in and perhaps taken Spain's place and recolonized some of these countries. In particular, Russia was now getting into the mix. Russia had formed what it called the Holy Alliance with Prussia and Austria, principally focused on restoring national leadership to powerful monarchs in Europe. But part of that could have been to continue to establish those monarchies through colonial holdings elsewhere in the world, including North and South America. In fact, Tsar Alexander, whom John Quincy Adams knew extremely well from his time as minister to Russia, the Tsar actually had his sights particularly set on the American Northwest area of present-day Washington State, British Columbia, that part of the world. The Russian Tsar actually felt that he was claiming that territory, even though the United States and Great Britain already had claims to that territory. Well, when this was coming out, John Quincy Adams was adamant with the Russian minister that this will not stand. He said the United States should contest the right of Russia to any territorial establishment on this continent, and that we should assume distinctly the principle that the American continents are no longer subjects for any European colonial establishment. Now, this was a really bold statement to make. The United States had only been, 50 years before, it was a bunch of colonies. It had only been a constitutional republic for 30 years. It was still not a major military power, although it had stood up to the British not once but twice. But now here's the Secretary of State coming out and saying, basically, Europe, stay out of not only our country, not only out of our continent, North America, but all of the Americas, all of the Western hemispheres. I believe, we, the United States, potentially believe you should stay out of our business, and perhaps we'll stay out of yours, because that was the other part of John Quincy Adams' thinking. He shared with one of his ministers abroad that for the repose of Europe as well as America, the European and American political systems should be kept as separate and distinct from each other as possible. He was formulating this policy idea that the United States would stay out of the affairs of Europe, and Europe would stay out of the affairs of the Americas, North and South America. Well, Adams continued to push this idea with his president, James Monroe, and Monroe was aligned with the thinking. It was time for a bold proclamation on the part of the Americans, and the pen went into the hands of John Quincy Adams to write out this new policy. When he handed the draft to the President of the United States, he said it was the most important paper that ever went from my hands. This was a bold move on the part of the Americans. John Quincy Adams had prepared it, and James Monroe was ready to deliver it. December 2nd, 1823, in his address to Congress, in what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, Monroe stated boldly that the occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. There it was, bold, black and white, a proclamation, a doctrine of foreign policy from James Monroe. He went on to say again that the United States will stay out of your business if you stay out of ours, but he also said if you disregard this warning, there could be consequences. You come in and try to recolonize areas of the Americas, the United States would take that as personal offense and potentially, again, act on that. Now, it was interesting that the United States really didn't have a military to back this up. In fact, Britain had gotten wind of this new policy idea and wanted to come to the American side. It was in their interest also to keep the rest of Europe out of the Americas, and they offered the Royal Navy to help enforce such a policy. And John Quincy Adams was absolutely against this and recommended to his president that they decline this treaty because they don't need Britain. The United States was mature enough and becoming a global player enough to make this stand on their own, and Monroe bought that, and they rejected the entreaty from the British. But again, didn't really have the strong military to enforce it. Nevertheless, the Monroe Doctrine basically worked. The European countries, the powerful ones, they really did stay out of the Americas for the bulk of the 19th century. Sure, there were some exceptions. France came into Mexico and basically took over that country during the American Civil War. It didn't last all that long, but these were few and far between. By and large, the European countries followed the Monroe Doctrine, in large part because they wanted the Americans to be their friends and not their enemies. Even if it wasn't a global military power yet, it was certainly becoming a global economic engine, and the European countries wanted to keep that on friendly terms with the United States. And for a variety of other reasons, the Monroe Doctrine basically did its task, and the Europeans stayed focused on Europe, the Americans stayed focused on the Americas, and it actually made a big difference for the United States in the boldest proclamation to date of foreign policy by an American administration. Monroe gets the name. It's the Monroe Doctrine. He gets the credit for that because he was the president who had to have the final say. John Quincy Adams, of course, had a lot of the idea. He wrote out the draft. He gets a lot of credit as well. Some historians seem to think it's either or, who should get more credit. It's really, they both get credit. It was a team effort. That's the way it should be. And it should have Monroe's name on it because he was president, but John Quincy Adams gets a lot of credit for the Monroe Doctrine as well. Well, the year is now 1824. It is an election season upon the United States of America. Who's going to replace James Monroe? That is going to be an interesting question, but it is a story for another day. That is John Quincy Adams and Secretary of State Part 2 from the life of John Quincy Adams. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.